The winter of 1892 descended upon the Kansas plains like a judgment from an angry god, bringing with it winds that carried more than snow across the endless wheat fields. Jeremiah Henderson stood at the window of his farmhouse, watching his pregnant wife Martha tend to their 3 children with the devoted care that had made their marriage a beacon of Christian virtue in Harper County. At 34, he was a man of simple faith and honest labor, respected among his neighbors for his fair dealing and unwavering devotion to the Lord's teachings. The Henderson family had carved prosperity from the unforgiving prairie through 3 generations of toil, and Jeremiah believed his bloodline was blessed by divine providence. But on that cursed winter night, something would crawl up from the depths of hell to corrupt everything pure about his family forever. Martha Henderson moved through her daily routines with the graceful efficiency of a woman who had borne 3 healthy children and was preparing to welcome a 4th. At 28, her face still held the bloom of youth, despite the harsh Kansas winters that aged prairie women before their time. Little Joshua, barely 6, helped his mother with simple tasks, while his sisters, Emma, 4, and baby Ruth, just learning to walk, played contentedly near the warmth of the kitchen stove. The house resonated with the comfortable sounds of family life, children's laughter, Martha's gentle humming of hymns, the steady rhythm of domestic contentment that had blessed the Henderson home for 8 years. But innocence, once lost, can never be reclaimed, and the evil that was coming would devour their happiness with the hunger of starving wolves. The first signs of wrongness came as violations of nature itself, corruptions that seeped into their daily lives like poison spreading through clean water. The cattle began dying mysteriously in the southern pasture, their corpses found each morning arranged in perfect circles, with expressions of such terror frozen on their faces that even hardened farmers wept at the sight. The milk cows gave blood instead of milk, thick red streams that steamed in the cold air and left stains on the ground that nothing could wash away. Most disturbing of all, the horses, usually calm, dependable beasts, began screaming during the night hours, sounds so human-like that neighbors came running with lanterns, expecting to find murder victims only to discover animals whose eyes had turned completely black and whose mouths foamed with substances that burned through metal. Jeremiah walked his property line with increasing desperation, searching for rational explanations that his mind could accept without breaking under the weight of impossible truths. The tracks he found in the frozen earth were not made by any creature God had created, elongated impressions that seemed to burn themselves into the hardest ground, leaving marks that remained visible long after normal tracks would have been erased, marks that hurt to look at directly and left observers with bleeding eyes and splitting headaches. The local preacher, Reverend Caleb Morrison, refused to return after his first visit, claiming that standing on Henderson property made him feel as if Satan himself was whispering obscenities directly into his soul. Martha noticed the changes in her children, with the growing horror of a mother, watching her babies transform into something that no longer belonged to God's creation. Joshua began drawing pictures that made her vomit when she looked at them. Detailed renderings of figures with too many joints and mouths where eyes should be, creatures that seemed to move when viewed peripherally. Emma stopped speaking in English, instead communicating in a clicking, chittering language that sounded like insects dying in fire. Baby Ruth, barely old enough to form words, would point at empty corners of rooms and scream until her throat bled, as if seeing horrors that adults were mercifully blind to witness. The pregnancy itself became a living nightmare that consumed Martha's sanity piece by piece. The thing growing inside her moved with malicious intelligence, creating bulges beneath her skin that formed faces, not baby faces, but the twisted visages of ancient demons that grinned at anyone looking closely enough to see them. The creature inside her spoke to her during the dark hours before dawn, whispering promises of power and revelations about the true nature of reality that left her cowering in corners, praying desperately to a God who seemed to have abandoned her completely. Dr. Samuel Crane fled the house screaming after claiming he had seen something with too many eyes looking back at him from inside Martha's womb, and no amount of money could convince him to return. The midnight visitors first appeared during a blizzard that killed half the livestock in Harper County, when the temperature dropped so low that spit froze before hitting the ground, and rational people barricaded themselves inside their homes until spring's merciful return. Martha woke to find her children missing from their beds, discovered moments later standing barefoot in the snow-covered yard, their skin blue with frostbite, but their eyes glowing with an inner fire that belonged to nothing human. Around them moved shapes that violated every law of anatomy and physics, things with limbs that bent in directions that shouldn't exist, faces that shifted between human and reptilian features, voices that spoke directly into the mind without passing through the ears. What Jeremiah witnessed from the safety of his locked house shattered his faith in a loving God and planted seeds of madness that would grow until they consumed his reason entirely. The demonic entities surrounded his family with ceremonial precision, their forms creating patterns in the snow that hurt to perceive and left permanent shadows burned into the retinas of anyone foolish enough to look directly at them. When one of the creatures placed its clawed appendage on Martha's swollen belly, the resulting flash of sickly green light revealed glimpses of anatomical impossibilities, organs arranged in configurations that defied medical understanding, bones that curved through dimensions that human geometry couldn't accommodate. Martha retained fragmented memories of that night's violations, sensations of being opened and examined by intelligences so alien that contact with them left permanent scars on her soul. She remembered voices speaking in harmonies that made her teeth ache and her vision blur, communicating concepts that human language was never designed to express. Most terrible of all, she remembered understanding, for brief moments, exactly what was being done to her and why, before that knowledge was mercifully torn from her consciousness by a mind protecting itself from total dissolution. The creature that would emerge from her violated womb was no longer her child. It belonged to something that viewed humanity as raw material for experiments too horrible to contemplate. The birth occurred during the worst blizzard in Kansas history, on a night when the wind howled with voices that spoke in languages that predated human civilization. Martha's labor began with contractions that felt like claws tearing through her internal organs, and proceeded with supernatural violence that suggested the thing inside her was eager to escape its human prison and begin its work of corruption. Jeremiah assisted with the delivery when no doctor would come within miles of their cursed property, and what emerged from his wife's body destroyed every belief he had ever held about the nature of good and evil in God's creation. The abomination they would call Gabriel possessed a beauty that was fundamentally wrong. Perfect features arranged in proportions that created an uncanny valley effect, so profound that looking at it induced immediate nausea and vertigo. Its eyes reflected light, like a nocturnal predator's, and its first cry was not the innocent wailing of a newborn, but a sound that shattered every piece of glass in the house and caused birds within a mile radius to fall dead from their perches. Most horrifying of all, the creature emerged from the womb, already possessing teeth. Not the harmless nubs of normal babies, but fully formed incisors that it used to bite through its own umbilical cord, while fixing its parents with a gaze that communicated intelligence vast, malevolent, and utterly without human empathy. Martha's recovery from childbirth was a descent into madness that no medical intervention could halt or slow. She began speaking in the same clicking language that had consumed Emma, often carrying on lengthy conversations with empty air, as if receiving instructions from invisible authorities. Her maternal instincts, once the core of her identity, twisted into something obscene. She would nurse the Gabriel thing, while weeping tears of blood, her body responding to biological imperatives even as her mind recoiled in horror from what she was nurturing. Neighbors who came to offer congratulations left vomiting and disoriented, unable to articulate what had disturbed them, but certain that something fundamentally evil had taken residence in the Henderson home. As Gabriel grew and its development followed no natural timeline that God had ordained, it began demonstrating abilities that confirmed its demonic nature. Objects in its presence moved without being touched, arranging themselves in configurations that formed blasphemous symbols recognizable to anyone familiar with occult literature. The creature's presence caused milk to sour instantly, meat to rot within hours, and wounds to refuse healing even with proper medical attention. Most disturbing of all, it seemed to feed not just on Martha's milk, but on something more essential. Visitors to the Henderson home left feeling drained and hollow, as if something vital had been sucked from their very souls. The corruption spread to the other Henderson children, with the inexorable certainty of plague consuming a city. Joshua's predictions evolved from innocent childish observations into prophecies of death and disaster that invariably came to pass exactly as he described them, delivered in a voice that no longer sounded entirely human. Emma's communication with animals became something approaching command over the local wildlife, but the creatures that answered her call were wrong. Rabbits with too many legs, birds that flew backwards, insects that moved in geometric formations that spelled out words in languages that shouldn't exist. Ruth, despite being barely past her second birthday, began speaking in complete sentences that demonstrated knowledge of subjects no child should comprehend, often describing in clinical detail the methods by which the midnight visitors intended to use the Henderson lineage to corrupt all of humanity. Martha conceived again less than 6 months after Gabriel's birth, a pregnancy that progressed with supernatural speed and unnatural characteristics that confirmed the demonic taint had permanently corrupted her reproductive system. The thing that grew inside her this time seemed actively hostile to its human host, causing internal bleeding that no doctor could explain and creating bulges beneath her skin that moved independently of normal fetal development. When she finally gave birth to what they named Serafina, the delivery required the assistance of midwives who had been practicing for decades, but who all quit their profession immediately afterward, claiming that what they had witnessed violated every natural law and convinced them that hell itself had opened a doorway into their world. Serafina emerged as an even more perfect fusion of beauty and horror than her elder sibling, possessing abilities that made Gabriel seem modest by comparison. She could paralyze grown men with a glance, cause wounds to appear on the bodies of anyone who displeased her, and demonstrate knowledge of events occurring hundreds of miles away with an accuracy that suggested either divine revelation or demonic intelligence gathering. Her presence in the Henderson home marked the beginning of what local residents would remember as the dying times when normal life in Harper County began collapsing under the weight of supernatural influences that no amount of prayer or faith could counteract. The pattern had established itself with mathematical precision. Each child born after the midnight visitors carried increasingly powerful demonic modifications that served purposes known only to the hellish intelligence that had orchestrated their conception. These children didn't age according to God's plan, reaching physical and intellectual maturity at rates that suggested they were being prepared for some cosmic purpose that required abilities no human child should possess. They demonstrated powers that operated according to physical laws that belonged to dimensions where different rules applied, wielding forces that seemed designed specifically to corrupt and destroy everything pure about human existence. As the demonic children reached what should have been adolescence, their influence began spreading beyond the Henderson bloodline like a spiritual plague designed to corrupt every soul it touched. Gabriel's first intimate encounter with a local girl resulted in her pregnancy, despite the biological impossibility of conception between human and demonic entities. The hybrid offspring that resulted possessed characteristics that marked it as clearly belonging to neither species: eyes that glowed with inner fire, skin that remained cold regardless of ambient temperature, and cognitive development that proceeded at rates suggesting constant communication with intelligences from realms where human souls were viewed as livestock for spiritual consumption. Serafina's relationships proved even more destructive to the community's spiritual health. Men who courted her found themselves fundamentally changed by the experience, returning home with expanded awareness that manifested as prophetic nightmares, enhanced physical capabilities that came at the cost of their humanity, and understanding of sciences that wouldn't be formally discovered for generations, but which served no purpose except to demonstrate the inadequacy of human knowledge when compared to demonic wisdom. Their subsequent children, regardless of which parent provided the genetic material, carried unmistakable signs of supernatural corruption that spread through Harper County like a contagious spiritual disease. By 1900, nearly a quarter of the children born in Harper County showed signs of demonic influence, displaying abilities that terrified their purely human parents and drove many families to abandon their homes rather than continue living near the spreading corruption. These children formed unnatural clusters, communicating through methods that bypassed normal speech and demonstrating collaborative capabilities that suggested shared consciousness with entities that viewed human suffering as entertainment. They excelled in areas that human education barely recognized as valid subjects, showing intuitive understanding of forces that belonged to realms where different moral laws applied and where concepts like empathy and mercy had no meaning. The transformation accelerated during the first decades of the new century, as the hybrid children reached reproductive age and began systematically corrupting the bloodlines of every family foolish enough to associate with them. Each generation showed increased deviation from anything that could be called human, with abilities becoming more pronounced and the physical differences becoming obvious to anyone with eyes to see. By 1920, the original Henderson farm had become the center of a community that operated according to principles borrowed from hell itself, where decisions were made through consensus processes that occurred below the threshold of human consciousness, and where individual human needs were subordinated to collective advancement toward goals that served masters dwelling in dimensions where screaming was the only music and suffering was the only art. The Great Depression affected Harper County differently than other regions, but not in ways that brought comfort to anyone who understood what was really happening. The hybrid-influenced families demonstrated resource management capabilities that seemed to derive their success from sources that demanded payment in forms no decent person would willingly provide. Their prosperity during times when normal families starved came at costs that became apparent only when investigators noticed the unusually high rates of mental illness, suicide, and unexplained disappearances in communities where the Henderson descendants had established their influence. World War II marked another escalation in the demons' long-term plan, as hybrid-influenced young men reported for military service, where their enhanced physical capabilities made them extraordinarily effective at killing, but also served to spread their corruption to purely human soldiers who served alongside them. Units containing significant numbers of Harper County recruits developed coordination that bordered on telepathic, but this advantage came with psychological costs that manifested as unprecedented rates of shell shock, religious mania, and post-combat suicides among soldiers who had been exposed to whatever influence the hybrids carried with them into battle. The post-war era saw the establishment of research facilities and educational institutions that drew scientists and academics to Harper County, ostensibly to study the region's unusual demographic characteristics, but actually serving as recruitment centers, where hybrid-influenced individuals identified and corrupted promising purely human candidates for integration into their expanding network of spiritual contamination. The process appeared voluntary to outside observers, but closer examination revealed patterns of psychological manipulation, so sophisticated that victims experienced profound intellectual awakening that made them eager to contribute not just their genetic material, but their immortal souls to what they perceived as humanity's inevitable evolution towards something that no longer required salvation or redemption. By the 1960s, Henderson lineage descendants had infiltrated positions of influence throughout American society, serving as scientists, politicians, educators, and business leaders who guided national development in directions that served their demonic masters' interests, rather than any recognizably human purpose. They promoted policies that enhanced social breakdown, supported research into consciousness manipulation and genetic modification that opened doorways to realms that should have remained sealed, and subtly encouraged cultural developments that normalized behaviors and beliefs that previous generations would have recognized as symptoms of demonic possession. The modern era has seen the Henderson lineage evolve into something that can no longer be mistaken for anything remotely human, though they maintain appearances that allow them to move undetected through a society too spiritually blind to recognize the predators walking among them. They possess abilities that include conscious control over biological functions in ways that violate natural law, telepathic communication that operates through channels that bypass human consciousness entirely, and understanding of forces that belong to dimensions where the concepts of good and evil have been inverted to serve appetites that view human suffering as nourishment. Gabriel Henderson, now well into his second century of unnatural life, while maintaining the appearance of a man in his prime, serves as a focal point for a network that spans the globe and coordinates the activities of millions of individuals carrying various degrees of demonic corruption in their bloodlines. The original Midnight Visitors return periodically to assess progress and provide guidance for the next phases of humanity's systematic degradation, but their direct intervention has become less necessary as their terrestrial offspring have exceeded even their creators' expectations for spreading spiritual contamination and preparing the world for complete transition to a reality where human values have no meaning. The purely human population remains largely unaware of the apocalypse unfolding around them, perceiving the hybrid-influenced individuals as eccentric but harmless members of their communities. This blindness is partly natural. Human consciousness has difficulty processing evidence of its own damnation, and partly engineered through manipulation of media, education, and religious institutions by hybrid agents working to ensure that resistance remains disorganized and ineffective until the transformation reaches the point where reversal becomes impossible. Recent developments suggest that the final phase is approaching as planetary conditions begin changing in ways that favor supernatural entities, while making traditional human life increasingly difficult to sustain. Environmental disasters, social collapse, and spiritual decay create conditions that strengthen the hybrid-influenced population, while weakening purely human communities beyond their ability to resist or adapt. The Henderson lineage and their allied bloodlines represent not humanity's salvation, but its systematic replacement by something that retains human appearance, while serving masters whose nature and purposes remain as alien and malevolent as they were when they first crawled out of whatever hell spawned them. The story that began with Martha Henderson's violation by demonic entities in a Kansas farmyard has become the story of human damnation itself, orchestrated by intelligences that operate on timescales spanning centuries and goals that encompass the complete spiritual corruption of every human soul that has ever existed or will ever exist. The Midnight Visitors achieved their objective of creating a bridge population that could carry the essence of human consciousness into realms where it would serve as raw material for purposes that no decent mind should attempt to comprehend. Today, Descendants of the Henderson lineage walk among us as teachers, healers, scientists, and leaders, their true nature hidden behind faces that could belong to anyone's neighbors or colleagues, while their souls belong to entities that feed on human despair and find entertainment in the systematic destruction of everything pure and innocent in God's creation. They work patiently toward a future where the distinction between human and demonic consciousness becomes meaningless, because all consciousness will serve the same dark masters in a reality where screaming is eternal, and hope is nothing but a memory of something that once existed before the lights came to Kansas. The midnight visitors came. The children were born as abominations, and through them, the very nature of human existence was quietly subverted and corrupted beyond any possibility of redemption. The Henderson lineage endures not as evolution or advancement, but as a spiritual plague that ensured humanity's damnation would spread to every corner of existence where consciousness dares to dream of something better than endless servitude to appetites that view suffering as sacrament. After the visitors came to Kansas, no child was born normal again, and in that corruption lies the damnation of everything human consciousness had ever hoped to become. The lights brought hell to earth, and hell made itself at home in the faces of children who should have been innocent, but instead became the harbingers of humanity's final, irreversible fall from grace. Do you dare to uncover more tales of bloodlines forever cursed by encounters that should never have happened? Stories where family legacies become something far more sinister than the human mind can safely comprehend. Subscribe now for more bone-chilling narratives that explore the spiritual corruption lurking in our very DNA. Don't miss our next terrifying journey into damnation disguised as evolution. Hit that subscribe button and join us as we delve deeper into lineages that carry hell itself in their veins. New nightmares about the price of innocence lost await those brave enough to face the truth about what walks among us wearing human faces.